Picture this. You're standing in the Montana Territory. It is a scorching, relentlessly hot day in late June 1876.
Oh, just brutally hot.
Right. And the air is so thick with this, like, choking yellow dust that you can barely see the man standing 5 feet next to you.
Yeah, visibility is basically zero in that kind of dust.
Exactly. And cutting through that dust, you hear the deliberate, rhythmic crack of single-shot cavalry carbines. But those shots are just being completely drowned out by an absolute barrage.
Just a continuous roar.
A roar of repeating rifles, yeah. You are standing on a dry, jagged ridgeline, and you're watching a legendary, highly trained cavalry regiment being, well, systematically and methodically dismantled piece by piece.
It is a truly terrifying scene to conceptualize because you are looking at a total tactical collapse happening in real time.
Right.
I mean, a modern, industrialized military force being completely unraveled by an enemy they fundamentally misunderstood.
So, if you've ever wondered how a seemingly invincible military force can be completely annihilated despite having what looks on paper like, a foolproof plan, you really need to hear this.
Absolutely.
Because today's deep dive into the source material is about stripping away the myth of what popular history has called Custer's last stand. We're taking a stack of incredible sources, including detailed battlefield archaeology, the forensic analysis of cartridge casings.
The forensic stuff is just mind-blowing.
It really is. Plus, we have survivor testimony from the 1879 Court of Inquiry and vital Native accounts that they completely shatter the traditional narrative.
We changed the entire picture.
Yeah. So we are going to reconstruct the Battle of the Little Bighorn hour by agonizing hour. We are looking at catastrophic intelligence failures, the devastating impact of microterrain, and a profound clash of military cultures. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
We can't just drop right onto that dusty ridgeline, right?
Yeah.
To understand how George Armstrong Custer and the 7th Cavalry ended up fighting for their lives, we have to look at the geopolitical powder keg that made this violent collision absolutely inevitable.
Yeah, you really cannot understand the tactical disaster of June 25th without understanding the massive strategic failures of the years leading up to it.
Right. The broader context.
Exactly. The roots of this conflict go directly back to the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. And this wasn't just a minor administrative agreement.
No, not
This treaty was supposed to be the definitive, lasting peace between the United States government and the Lakota Sioux. I mean, it granted the Lakota exclusive, unquestioned rights to the Black Hills, a region known as Bahasapa.
And we should clarify, this wasn't just like hunting land to them.
Oh, no. It was a region of profound cultural and spiritual significance. It was their sacred center,
Right.
The place where their creation stories are actually rooted. And the treaty explicitly stated that no white person would be permitted to settle upon or occupy the territory or even, pass through it without consent.
But, treaties on the frontier often had a very short shelf life.
Very short.
Especially when economics came into play. Because in 1874, the U.S. military sends a massive expedition directly into that sacred treaty-protected territory.
Which is just a blatant violation.
Right. And it's led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Now, I always thought this was like a mapping expedition, but it had a very specific underlying economic motive, didn't it?
It absolutely did.
Because the country was reeling from the financial panic of 1873, and they were desperate for a way to inject wealth into the economy.
That is the exact context. Custer's 1874 Black Hills expedition was officially, scientific and exploratory.
Sure, officially.
But they brought along professional miners, and the expedition confirmed exactly what the government was hoping for, the presence of gold.
And that changes everything.
It changes the entire landscape of the American West.
Yeah.
I mean, the moment gold is verified, prospectors, miners, and settlers just absolutely flood into the Black Hills.
It's like a gold rush on steroids.
Pretty much. We are talking about thousands of people setting up illegal mining camps in open, flagrant defiance of the treaty guarantees the U.S. government had just signed, 6 years prior.
So the government is caught in a bind of their own making. They promise this land to the Lakota, but they don't have the political will. Or maybe they just don't want to stop thousands of American citizens from extracting gold from it.
Exactly. It's a political nightmare for them.
I assume they tried to just buy their way out of the problem.
They did try that. The United States government initially made these half-hearted attempts to use the military to turn back miners, but it was like trying to hold back the tide.
Just impossible.
Right. So they shifted tactics and tried to purchase the land outright, or at least, lease the mineral rights. They actually sent a commission to negotiate.
I can't imagine offering to buy, say, the Vatican or Mecca from the people who consider it their spiritual epicenter went over particularly well.
Yeah, it was met with an absolute, unequivocal refusal. I mean, the Black Hills were entirely non-negotiable for the Lakota.
Makes sense.
So, with the diplomatic avenue firmly closed, by late 1875, the federal government makes a drastic policy shift.
They just dropped the act.
They completely abandon the pretense of protecting the treaty and issue an ultimatum. They declare that any native bands not reported to designated Indian agencies and reservations by January 31st, 1876 are officially labeled as hostile.
A winter deadline on the Great Plains.
Yeah.
That almost seems deliberately designed to be impossible to comply with. I mean, even if these dispersed bands wanted to pack up their entire winter camps and march through blizzards to a reservation, a lot of them physically couldn't do it.
It was largely a pretext. So when that deadline inevitably passed, the Department of the Interior basically washed its hands of the situation.
And handed it over to the military.
Exactly. They handed the problem over to the War Department.
Yeah.
So General of the Army, William Tecumseh Sherman, is tasked with preparing a massive military campaign for the summer of 1876.
To do what, exactly?
The objective is simple accessed. Violently compel compliance. Force the Lakota and their allies onto the reservations and clear the Black Hills.
Right.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the government fundamentally misread the native resolve to defend sacred territory.
They completely missed the sheer scale of the resistance that was brewing, because this wasn't just, a few rogue raiding parties. You have this unprecedented coalition forming.
A massive gathering.
Yeah, we had the Lakota Sioux, the Northern Cheyenne, the Arapaho all coming together, and the leadership structure that emerges here is absolutely brilliant.
Truly remarkable leadership.
You have Sitting Bull providing the spiritual vision, the gravity, the ultimate cohesion for this massive gathering. He actually conducts a Sundance in early June and has a vision of soldiers falling upside down into the native camp, which just electrifies the coalition.
It gave them immense confidence.
And then for operational battlefield command, you have these brilliant tactical minds taking charge. Crazy Horse, Chief Gall, Two Moons, Lame White Man.
It was a coalition unlike anything the United States Army had ever faced during the Plains Wars.
Really? How so?
Well, historically, native bands were highly decentralized. They fought in small, mobile raiding groups focused on hit-and-run tactics, acquiring horses, and demonstrating individual bravery.
Right, guerrilla tactics.
Exactly. Sustaining a massive standing army was totally contrary to their logistical capabilities because, you have to feed thousands of people and graze tens of thousands of horses.
Which strips the land bare really fast.
It does. But the existential threat to the Black Hills, combined with the really rich hunting grounds of the Powder and Bighorn River country, it drew them together and kept them together.
That makes sense.
We are talking about a combined moving encampment of 8,000 to 10,000 people with an estimated fighting force of anywhere from 1,500 to 2,500 warriors.
It's like a classic military siege scenario where a dispersed, besieged force suddenly decides to consolidate, break out, and form a massive conventional field army to meet the enemy head-on.
That's a great way to look at it.
Did the U.S. military have any inkling that they weren't hunting a few hundred stragglers, but an unprecedented, unified coalition of up to 10,000 people?
They operated in a state of near-total intelligence blindness.
Wow.
I mean, the Indian Bureau estimated maybe 500 to 800 hostiles were off the reservations, and Army intelligence consistently relied on those severely flawed numbers.
So they were walking into a trap of their own ignorance.
Yeah, they were planning a campaign against a fragmented, disorganized enemy that they firmly believed would just scatter at the very first sight of a blue uniform.
The old assumptions.
Right. The entire doctrine of the U.S. cavalry in the West was built on the premise that the hardest part of the war was simply catching the enemy. They had no idea they were marching into the teeth of a unified, highly motivated army.
And that massive intelligence failure sets the stage for the grand strategy for the summer of 1876. Because the U.S. Army underestimated this coalition so severely, they devised this overly complex, incredibly brittle strategy that just shattered the moment it made contact with reality.
It was a logistical nightmare from the start.
Let's break down General Sherman's plan. They decide on a converging column strategy. 3 massive prongs moving through the wilderness.
It's a massive operational undertaking, a classic pincer movement executed on a territorial scale that is honestly hard to fathom today.
Who was leading these columns?
You have Brigadier General Alfred Terry commanding the Dakota column, moving west from Fort Abraham Lincoln in modern North Dakota. Then you have Colonel John Gibbon commanding the Montana column, moving east from Fort Ellis.
Okay, that's two.
And you have Brigadier General George Crook commanding the Wyoming column, moving north from Fort Fetterman. The intended target is the hostile concentration somewhere in the vast, completely unmapped wilderness of the Yellowstone and Powder River corridors.
The theory is that you trap the native forces between these converging wings. You hammer them from three sides, forcing them to surrender or be ground to dust.
That's what it looked like on paper, yeah.
But let's look at the mechanics of 1876 military logistics. You are trying to coordinate three independent armies across hundreds of miles of broken, hostile, unmapped terrain. There are no field radios.
No.
There are no telegraph lines stringing across the Powder River Basin. If Terry wants to tell Crook he's running 2 days late, how does he actually do it?
He has to write a message on a piece of paper, hand it to a courier on a horse, and just hope the courier can survive a ride of 200 miles through territory completely controlled by the enemy.
That is terrifying.
It was a plan built on incredibly fragile assumptions. I mean, it required all three columns to arrive in the same general vicinity at roughly the exact same time to create the trap.
Which never happens in war.
Exactly. If any one of those columns hits a snag, the anvil disappears, and the hammer basically strikes nothing.
Or worse, the hammer gets completely destroyed. And that first pillar of the plan collapses completely on the 17th of June at the Battle of the Rosebud.
A very crucial battle.
This is the massive, blaring warning sign that the Army just completely misses. Let's dig into the Rosebud, because what happens to General Crook changes the entire geometry of the campaign. Crook is marching north with the strongest single column, about 1,300 cavalry and infantrymen.
And Crook is a seasoned Indian fighter. He thinks he's moving in for the kill. But on the morning of June 17th, near the upper Rosebud Creek, Crook's column had halted to rest.
We were just taking a break.
Yeah, his men were making coffee, and suddenly his advance guard of Shoshone and Crow Scouts is struck by a massive native force cresting the ridges.
Just out of nowhere.
Right. We were talking about roughly 1,500 Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, led primarily by Crazy Horse. And these are the very same fighters who, just over a week later, will be waiting at the Little Bighorn.
And what fascinates me here is the tactical shift. If I'm reading the traditional history of the Plains Wars, the native warriors should fire a few volleys, steal some horses, and just vanish into the hills.
That's what Crook expected.
But this isn't a hit-and-run raid. This turns into a brutal 6-hour pitched battle across miles of terrain.
That is the crucial paradigm shift. Crook hastily deploys his cavalry in a dismounted skirmish order and uses his infantry to block the rocky ravines.
Right.
He fully expects the warriors to break contact once he establishes a firm defensive line. But the native warriors don't flee. They are fighting a highly coordinated, sustained tactical battle.
Under Crazy Horse's command.
Yes. Crazy Horse is directing a battlefield masterpiece here. Native accounts describe how some warrior contingents deliberately fixed Crook's infantry in place.
Like keeping them pinned down with suppressive fire.
Exactly. While other highly mobile mounted elements continuously probed and attempted to envelop his flanks, they were using really sophisticated battlefield maneuvers, shifting forces to exploit weaknesses in Crook's lines.
So they are pinning the center and trying to roll up the sides. That requires intense coordination and discipline, which completely contradicts the Army's belief that they were fighting a disorganized mob.
It shattered that assumption entirely.
After 6 hours of this relentless pressure, Crook realizes he is in serious trouble. He has taken significant casualties, roughly 30 men killed and over 50 wounded.
And his men are just exhausted.
His horses are blown, his ammunition reserves are severely depleted. So he makes a critical decision. He halts his northward advance entirely, abandons his role in the three-pronged strategy, and withdraws south to Goose Creek to resupply and wait for reinforcements.
And here's the fatal consequence of that decision. Crook effectively takes his column, the strongest of the three, remember, completely out of the campaign.
Just off the board?
Yep. The Rosebud proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the native warriors had evolved their tactics. They were no longer fighting to escape. They were fighting to destroy U.S. military units in the field.
But the broader strategic tragedy is the communication blackout you mentioned earlier. Crook turns around and marches south. He has effectively benched himself. But nobody tells General Terry or Colonel Gibbon, who are marching from the east and west. It's like launching a massive three-pronged flanking maneuver, but your southern anvil has just shattered into pieces, and your northern hammer has absolutely no idea.
That is the exact tactical reality of the situation. Terry and Custer are continuing their maneuvers under the strict assumption that Crook is driving the native forces north, directly into their path.
Which is completely false.
Right. They are operating on a strategic phantom. They believe they are closing a trap that has actually already been broken wide open.
So with Crook entirely out of the picture and licking his wounds to the south, we move to the approach of the Dakota column. General Terry and Colonel Gibbon link up on the Yellowstone River.
And this is where the plan gets refined.
Yeah. Terry decides to detach Custer and the 7th Cavalry to act as the primary strike force. The 7th Cavalry at this point is a formidable unit of roughly 647 men.
A very strong force on paper.
Right. Terry gives Custer written orders on the 22nd of June. And reading those orders, there is a massive, glaring loophole.
There really is. Terry instructs Custer to advance south down the Rosebud Creek, following the massive native trail they had discovered.
Okay.
The plan was for Custer to march far to the south, then wheel west to herd the native forces toward Terry and Gibbon's slower-moving infantry, who would be marching up the Bighorn River.
Like a sweeping motion.
Exactly. But the orders explicitly give Custer the freedom to depart from the plan if he sees sufficient reason.
That's a pretty big blank check.
It is. Terry was an experienced commander. He was trying to balance a coordinated territorial campaign with the absolute necessity of allowing a cavalry commander on the ground to act on immediate, perishable intelligence.
Terry even offers Custer some heavy firepower to take with him. He offers him a detachment of Gatling guns from the 20th Infantry.
Which Custer turns down.
Now, to me, if I'm marching into hostile, unmapped territory and I might be outnumbered, I want maximum firepower. Leaving a battery of rapid-fire weapons behind seems like pure arrogance.
It's very easy to view it as arrogance in hindsight. And, well, ego certainly played a part in Custer's decision-making.
Sure.
But if we look strictly at his tactical doctrine, it was entirely about speed and mobility.
Mm-hmm.
We have to explain what a Gatling gun battery looked like in 1876.
They weren't exactly portable, right?
You know, these weren't sleek, lightweight machine guns. They were heavy, cumbersome artillery pieces mounted on large wheeled carriages.
Oh, wow.
Furthermore, they were going to be pulled by condemned cavalry horses that were old, sick, or deemed unfit for regular service.
So they'd be incredibly slow.
Exactly. Dragging those heavy carriages over broken, roadless, ravine terrain would have drastically slowed down the 7th Cavalry's rate of march.
And speed was everything to Custer.
It was his entire military philosophy in the West. It rested on the idea that you had to strike fast before the village could break down their lodges and scatter.
He was prioritizing maneuverability over massed firepower.
Yes. He firmly believed the single-shot carbines of his troopers were more than enough to handle any native force, provided he could just catch them.
So Custer pushes his men incredibly hard. They are logging up to 30 miles a day through brutal heat and suffocating dust.
Just exhausting the men and the horses.
And by the evening of June 24th, his Crow and Arikara scouts, who are, reading the landscape like a book, are finding undeniable signs of a massive presence.
Huge sign.
We're talking pony herds so large they have grazed the hills completely bare, enormous dust clouds lingering in the air, and trail signs indicating thousands of people moving together.
You couldn't miss it.
Finally, at dawn on the morning of June 25th, from a high vantage point known as the Crow's Nest, the scouts spot the immense encampment nestled in the Little Bighorn Valley.
And the scouts really try to warn Custer. They tell him the pony herd looks like a massive brown carpet spread across the valley.
That's an incredible image.
They tell him there are more Sioux down there than the army has bullets.
A literal warning.
But Custer makes his fateful decision right then and there. During the march, his men had accidentally dropped a box of hardtack on the trail.
Oh, right, the bread box.
Yeah. When a squad went back to retrieve it, they found native warriors opening the box. Custer concludes that his command has been definitively spotted.
So he thinks the clock is running out.
Exactly. Fearing that this massive village will instantly break down their lodges and scatter to the winds if he waits even another day, he decides to attack immediately.
Without Terry and Gibbon.
He does not wait for their infantry to get into blocking positions. He does not conduct a thorough, close-in reconnaissance to ascertain the true size or exact layout of the camp.
He just rushes in.
And crucially, fatally, he decides to divide his regiment.
He takes his 647 men and fractures them into 4 separate elements.
Which is just wild.
It is. He sends Major Marcus Reno with 3 companies to attack the southern end of the village. He sends Captain Frederick Benteen with 3 companies to sweep far to the southwest to block any potential escape routes.
Right.
He leaves 1 company under Captain Thomas McDougal in the rear to guard the slow-moving pack train, which contains all the reserve ammunition. And Custer takes 5 companies himself to maneuver north along the eastern ridgelines.
A total fracturing of his force.
Why divide a smaller force in the face of an enemy you already suspect is large? I mean, Custer is violating the absolute core military principle of mass. You concentrate your forces, you don't divide them when you're marching into an unknown situation. Was he just blinded by his past successes?
He was entirely a prisoner of his past experience, specifically the Battle of the Washita in 1868.
What happened there?
At the Washita, he attacked a much smaller winter camp by splitting his force into 4 columns and hitting them simultaneously from all sides at dawn.
Ah, so it worked before.
He created absolute panic, prevented escape, and secured a decisive victory. Custer viewed the 7th Cavalry as the ultimate shock force.
He thought they were invincible.
He genuinely believed that the sudden appearance of cavalry charging from multiple vectors would induce a paralyzing rout, regardless of the enemy's numerical superiority.
It's the psychological impact.
Yeah, he thought the sheer psychological shock of the blue uniforms appearing on the ridges would win the day. But this village was too big to scatter.
It wasn't a small winter camp.
No, it was a sprawling, fortified municipality of veteran warriors. And by splitting his force into 4 unsupporting, disconnected detachments over incredibly broken terrain, he voluntarily surrendered the only tactical advantages he possessed: concentrated firepower and mutual defense.
It is the ultimate tragedy of applying a previously successful tactical doctrine to an enemy that has fundamentally changed the rules of the game.
Exactly.
Custer's decision to split his forces isn't just a map exercise. It has immediate, terrifying consequences for the men on the ground. Let's follow Major Marcus Reno, because he is the vanguard.
He's the tip of the spear.
He is the first piece of Custer's divided force to make contact. At roughly 12:30 hours, Reno leads his battalion companies A, G, and M, which is only about 130 men down into the valley floor of the Little Bighorn. He splashes across the river and begins his assault.
And Reno's orders from Custer are to strike the southern end of the village, and that Custer would support him with the whole outfit.
That's what he was told.
As Reno's men advance down the valley floor, they transition from a trot to a gallop. The troopers are drawing their weapons.
They think they have the element of surprise.
They are fully expecting to ride down fleeing non-combatants and maybe engage a disorganized rear guard trying to buy time for the village to escape.
But at 12:45 hours, the reality of the situation hits them like a physical wall.
A literal wall of warriors.
Instead of a fleeing village, the dust clearing reveals hundreds, then potentially over 1,000 warriors, mounting their ponies and riding directly out to meet Reno's charge head-on.
The psychological shock of that specific moment cannot be overstated. I mean, Reno is leading 130 men, expecting a pursuit, and suddenly he is staring down a tidal wave of heavy cavalry.
It must have been terrifying.
He realizes instantly that continuing a mounted charge into that mass is absolute suicide. His small battalion would be swallowed whole.
So what does he do?
He makes a split-second tactical call. He halts the charge. He orders his battalion to dismount and form a skirmish line across the valley floor, anchoring his right flank in a dense strip of timber along the riverbank.
We really need to explain the mechanics of what happens to a 19th century cavalry unit when they are ordered to dismount in combat. Because when I hear skirmish line, I picture, like, Revolutionary War soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder in a neat row. Is that what Reno's men are doing in the middle of this chaos?
Not at all. A skirmish line meant the men were spread out, usually 5 to 15 yards apart, kneeling or lying prone to present a smaller target.
Okay, that makes more sense.
But the most critical factor is the horses. Standard U.S. cavalry doctrine dictated that when dismounted, every 4th man becomes a horse holder.
A horse holder.
Yes. One trooper takes the reins of his own horse, plus the reins of 3 other horses from the men next to him, and leads them to the rear for safety.
Wow.
So the moment Reno shouts the order to dismount, his actual fighting strength on the firing line is instantly reduced by 25%.
Wait, So if I'm the number 4 man, I'm holding 4 massive, terrified animals while bullets are flying, trying to control them so they don't stampede. I can't even fire my own weapon to defend myself.
Exactly. You are just trying to manage panicking horses.
That is devastating to their combat effectiveness.
It is. Reno only has about 90 men actually firing their carbines on that line. 90 men facing down a coordinated assault by hundreds of veteran warriors.
And let's talk about the weaponry, because the mechanics of the firearms play a massive role in how this battle unfolds. The 7th Cavalry is armed with the Springfield Model 1873 carbine, famously known as the Trapdoor Springfield.
A very iconic weapon.
It's a powerful weapon, firing a heavy .45-70 caliber bullet. It has great range and stopping power. But it is a single-shot breech loader.
Right, it is not a repeater.
No.
The mechanics of firing it under stress are incredibly complex. You fire, you flip open the breech block, the trap door, you extract the spent casing, manually insert a new cartridge from your belt, close the breech, cock the heavy hammer, aim, and fire again.
That's a lot of steps when people are charging at you.
And the ammunition itself was deeply flawed. In 1876, the Army was using cartridges made of relatively soft copper.
Which creates a massive failure point when the weapon gets hot.
Precisely. As you fire rapidly, the chamber of the carbine heats up. In the suffocating dust, the panic, and the intense heat of a Montana summer, when that black powder explodes, it fouls the chamber with thick residue.
Like a glue, almost.
Yeah, and the soft copper casing expands upon firing and melds into the hot, fouled chamber. So when the trooper flips open the trapdoor, the extractor mechanism rips right through the soft rim of the copper casing, leaving the empty shell completely jammed inside the gun.
Leaving you with a highly expensive club.
Exactly. Troopers had to frantically pull out their hunting knives and desperately pry the jammed copper casings out of the breech while under incredibly heavy fire.
While they're struggling with single-shot rifles that are literally jamming in their hands, the native warriors are heavily armed with repeating rifles. We are talking about Winchester Model 1866s and Henry repeaters.
Devastating firepower.
They hold 12 to 15 rounds in a tubular magazine. They can fire as fast as the shooter can work the lever. The sheer volume of fire coming at Reno's thin skirmish line of 90 men is just overwhelming.
It was a wall of lead.
By 1330 hours, Reno's position on the valley floor is completely untenable. The native warriors are using the deep brush, the undulating microterrain, and the dry creek beds of the valley floor to infiltrate his flanks completely unseen. They are pouring devastating, enfilading fire into the timber.
Reno essentially loses tactical control. I mean, the noise alone is deafening. Hundreds of firearms, screaming horses, the coordinated whistle, and mirror signals of the native commanders.
Just absolute chaos.
Reno's left flank, which is hanging out in the open valley, is threatening to collapse entirely, enveloped by highly mobile, mounted warriors sweeping around them. He attempts to pivot his entire line back into the timber for better cover, but the command structure is fracturing under the chaos.
It's falling apart.
Native warriors are now firing directly into the grove from the brush on the opposite bank. And during this chaos, a scout standing right next to Reno is shot in the head, splattering Reno with blood and brain matter.
Oh my God.
That psychological shock seems to break Reno's composure completely. He realizes he has to get his men out of that timber or they will be annihilated in the trees. So he orders a retreat back across the river to the high bluffs on the eastern side. But no bugle calls are sounded.
No bugles.
No, the orders just pass by shouting over the roar of the guns.
It's like a vanguard unit attempting a reconnaissance in force, only to realize they've accidentally launched a frontal assault on a reinforced citadel, and now they have to run for their lives, a complete rout.
Rout is the exact reality. I mean, a military fighting withdrawal requires intense discipline, covering fire, and a methodical stepping back by alternating units.
Leapfrogging back.
Right. But Reno's retreat was a chaotic, disorganized scramble for survival. Men who didn't hear the shouted orders were just left behind in the timber. Men were running for their horses, trying to mount up under point-blank fire.
Every man for himself.
Once they broke from the timber and hit the open valley floor, it was a desperate race to the river. The native warriors, mounted on swift, fresh ponies, simply rode in among them.
You're describing a complete collapse of unit cohesion. At that point, it's not even a battle anymore, it's a hunt.
The native accounts confirm exactly that. They compared it to chasing buffalo. They were simply riding alongside the fleeing troopers, shooting them from the saddle, or pulling them from their horses and killing them in hand-to-hand combat. The crossing of the Little Bighorn River itself became a deadly, choked bottleneck.
Because it's steep, right?
Very. The banks were steep, the water was treacherous, and warriors stood on the banks, plunging fire into the struggling soldiers and horses. Then came the agonizing, desperate climb up a steep, exposed coulee to reach the high bluffs on the eastern side.
Just a massacre.
By the time Reno's shattered, panicked battalion reached the top of what is now called Reno Hill, they had lost roughly 40 to 45 men killed, with dozens more wounded. Almost a third of his entire command was wiped out in under an hour of fighting.
If they're locked down tight on that hill, dealing with the bloody aftermath of Reno's rout, gasping for air, what is happening to Custer?
That's the million-dollar question.
Custer has no idea this just happened. He is maneuvering on the ridges to the north, completely unaware that his Anvil Reno's assault has just been utterly smashed into pieces.
He is flying blind.
We need to look at the anatomy of the broader disaster, focusing on Captain Benteen's sweeping mission and the critical geography of a place called Medicine Tail Coulee.
Okay, let's track Captain Frederick Benteen. Remember, Custer had sent Benteen's 3 companies on a wide, sweeping left hook to the southwest.
Right?
The idea was to flesh out any native bands attempting to flee the valley. But Benteen finds absolutely nothing but rugged, endless, empty hills. He exhausts his horses marching up and down these useless ridges.
Just wasting time and energy.
He realizes he is entirely out of the fight and decides, on his own initiative, to abandon the sweep and march back toward the trail of the main command.
At roughly 1300 hours, as Benteen is making his way back, he's met by a messenger galloping furiously toward him. A trumpeter named John Martin, originally Giovanni Martini, an Italian immigrant who barely spoke English.
Right.
Martin's horse is actually bleeding from a gunshot wound to the neck, indicating he just rode through intense action. He hands Benteen a hastily scribbled note from Custer's adjutant, Lieutenant William Cook.
The famous note.
The note is iconic. It reads, "Benteen, come on, big village, be quick, bring packs. P.S. Bring packs."
It is one of the most famous, heavily scrutinized dispatches in American military history. And we really have to analyze what it tells us about Custer's mindset at that exact moment.
When a seasoned adjutant writes "bring packs" twice in a frantic scribbled note, that's not just a routine logistical request.
No, not at all.
The packs are carried by the slow-moving mules in the rear, and they contain the regimental reserve of ammunition. That note is a commander realizing he has kicked a massive hornet's nest.
Exactly.
He realizes the village is immense, it isn't running away, and his men are going to burn through their standard issue of 50 rounds of carbine ammunition incredibly fast. Did Custer realize his envelopment was already failing?
He certainly realized the scope of the battle had shifted dramatically from a mop-up pursuit to a major sustained engagement. Between 1230 and 1400 hours, Custer is moving his 5 companies north along the eastern ridge lines.
Trying to find a way in.
He is desperately trying to find a way down the steep bluffs into the village to execute his hammer blow and support Reno, whom he assumes is still fighting in the valley.
But he's lost the element of surprise.
Completely. The element of surprise, which his entire plan relied upon, is just gone.
Why? What gives him away?
The dust.
Ah, the dust again.
200 cavalry horses moving at a trot or a gallop along a dry, elevated ridgeline throw up a massive, towering plume of yellow dust that acts like a beacon visible for miles.
So everyone can see him coming.
The entire village can track his exact progress. As warriors return from shattering Reno in the valley, they look up, see Custer's dust cloud moving north, and they don't panic. They simply cross the river, use the dense brush for cover, and ride up the ravines to intercept him.
Around 1400 hours, Custer sends a detachment down a natural draw called Medicine Tail Coulee. We really need to explain what a coulee is, because the terrain dictates everything here.
The terrain is the main character.
A coulee is essentially a dry creek bed, right? A deep ravine carved by water runoff that cuts through the steep hills. This specific coulee leads directly to a shallow ford on the river, directly across from the sprawling center of the native village.
The microterrain is the defining factor of this entire phase of the battle. The coulees and ravines like Medicine Tail were natural, gently sloping avenues of approach from the high ridges down to the water.
So it looks like a good path.
Custer naturally chose it as his attack route. But to the native warriors, who knew this ground intimately, these coulees were natural topographical traps. They were funnels.
It's like walking into a narrow hallway where the enemy controls all the doors. The cavalry is channeled down this narrow descending path, losing their high ground advantage.
Precisely.
Evidence from the battlefield, specifically the cartridge casings mapped out by archaeologists decades later, shows that a brief, Incredibly intense skirmish occurred right at the riverbank at Medicine Tail Ford.
They hit a wall of fire.
The cavalry detachment reaches the water, fully intending to charge across into the village. But the opposite bank is swarming with hundreds of warriors pouring devastating fire across the shallow water.
They just can't push through it.
The cavalry is instantly driven back. They cannot cross. They are forced to turn around, retreat back up the coulee, away from the river, and back up into the high exposed ground of the ridges.
This specific repulse at the ford is the turning point for Custer. The hammer strike fails completely. He cannot penetrate the village. From this moment on, Custer loses the tactical initiative.
He's on the defensive now.
He's no longer attacking, he is reacting. He is forced to pull his command northward, seeking defensible high ground along a series of jagged ridges.
And once he pulls back to those ridges, the clock starts ticking on his total destruction.
It does.
Driven away from the ford, Custer's remaining 210 men are now isolated on the high ground, surrounded by a landscape that is rapidly swarming with warriors coming up from the valley. Let's walk through the collapse of Custer's battalion, step by step, starting around 1430 hours at a position known as Calhoun Hill.
So as Custer moves north along the spine of the ridge, he drops off Company L, commanded by his brother-in-law, Lieutenant James Calhoun.
Okay.
Calhoun's mission is to act as a rear guard, holding a prominent rise to protect the southern flank of Custer's moving position. Calhoun deploys his men in a textbook skirmish line across the hill. Company C is positioned slightly to the west to support them.
And they are hit by an incredibly coordinated, overwhelming assault. Chief Gall and Crazy Horse are directing this phase of the battle, and again, the microterrain is the ultimate weapon.
It absolutely is. The ridges Custer occupied are not smooth, rolling hills like you see on a golf course.
Right.
They're incredibly rugged, cut by deep, steep-sided ravines, washouts, and draws that lead up from the river. The native warriors utilized this microterrain perfectly.
How did they do it?
Hundreds of warriors dismounted, left their ponies in the rear, and crept up these deep draws. They remained completely out of sight of the cavalrymen on the ridge above them.
So the soldiers couldn't even see what they were shooting at.
The troopers couldn't shoot what they couldn't see. The warriors would crawl up the ravines until they were just dozens of yards away, suddenly emerge over the crest, unleash a devastating volley of repeating rifle fire or a storm of arrows, and immediately drop back down into cover before the troopers could reload their jammed Springfields.
It's like watching a tide come in. Custer's men are on the high ground, which should be a massive defensive advantage, but the terrain is so jagged that the native warriors are flowing up the ravines like water, completely unseen, rising and rising until they suddenly breach the crest right in front of the troopers' faces.
It completely negates the long-range advantage of the Springfield carbine.
You have troopers firing blindly into the brush down the slope while warriors are maneuvering right up to their bootlaces. During this massive assault on Calhoun Hill, a prominent northern Cheyenne war chief named Lame White Man leads a devastating, fatal charge that shatters Calhoun's skirmish line.
It just breaks them.
Company L is rolled up and annihilated in minutes.
With the southern flank completely gone, the entire defensive structure of Custer's battalion begins to unravel. The native forces surge over the bodies on Calhoun Hill and push north along the ridge.
Like a domino effect.
Exactly. The next major element they encounter is Company I, commanded by Captain Miles Keogh. Keogh tries to form a rallying position in a slight depression on the east side of the ridge to stop the native advance.
And Keogh's men suffer the exact same fate. They are surrounded, overwhelmed by the sheer numbers and the incredible volume of rapid fire, and destroyed in brutal close-quarters combat.
Hand to hand.
It's worth noting that the only known U.S. survivor found alive days later from this entire part of the battlefield was Keogh's horse, Comanche, who was badly wounded but lived to become a somber symbol for the regiment.
Yeah, Comanche is a legendary figure in cavalry lore. By 1530 hours to 1600 hours, the situation for the remaining troopers on the main spine, which we call Battle Ridge, is catastrophic.
It's all falling apart.
The forensic evidence left behind, the specific patterns of empty cartridge casings found by archaeologists in the 1980s and 90s using metal detectors, paints a grim, undeniable picture.
What does the archaeology show?
It does not show a heroic static defense. It shows a desperate, frantic, fighting retreat. Troopers are utilizing reverse slopes, hiding on the backside of the hills to shield themselves from the plunging fire coming from the village side.
They're just trying to survive.
They pop up to fire a hasty volley and then fall back again as their flanks give way.
It's a terrifying scenario. They are being constricted in a cauldron, realizing that taking the high ground isn't an advantage if the enemy has enough manpower to surround you on all 360 degrees and slowly squeeze the perimeter tight.
The noose is tightening.
And that deadly constriction leads directly to Last Stand Hill.
Right. By 1600 hours, the final remnants of Custer's command, perhaps 40 to 50 men, including Custer himself, his brothers Tom and Boston, and his nephew Otte Reed, gather on a dusty northern knoll at the very end of the ridge.
Nowhere left to run.
This is Last Stand Hill. They are completely surrounded by thousands of warriors. They shoot their own horses to form crude, bleeding breastworks to hide behind.
That's how desperate it was.
The native eyewitness accounts describe the soldiers fighting with grim, terrifying discipline in those final moments, firing steady volleys that briefly check the incoming assaults.
But the ammunition is running out. The packs never arrived.
No, they didn't. Once the soldiers' firing slackened because they were out of bullets or their guns were permanently jammed, the end came with breathtaking speed.
A final rush.
Mounted warriors charged over the horse breastworks, and the fighting dissolved into a brutal, chaotic, hand-to-hand melee. Thick yellow dust and heavy black powder gun smoke completely obscured the hill.
But the archaeology tells us there is one last desperate attempt to survive. Evidence from cartridge casings and corroborating native accounts confirm that a group of men, largely from Company E, attempted a sudden breakout from Last Stand Hill just before it fell.
A breakout attempt, yeah.
They plunged down a steep, narrow gully known as Deep Ravine, perhaps trying to reach the brush along the river, or maybe just trying to find deep cover to hide in.
But the ravine was a fatal dead end. It provided absolutely no cover from above.
None at all.
Warriors lined the rim of the deep ravine and simply poured fire down into it, like shooting into a barrel. Every single man who attempted that breakout into Deep Ravine was killed.
Unbelievable.
By roughly 1630 hours, the heavy firing on the Custer Ridges finally fell silent. All 210 men of Custer's immediate detachment were dead.
It is a stunning total annihilation. Not a single man left standing. But while Custer and his men are bleeding out into the dust on those ridges, the rest of the regiment is fighting a desperate war of survival just a few miles away.
Right. The battle isn't over.
This takes us to the grueling siege of Reno Hill. Let's rewind the clock slightly to 1430 hours. Major Reno and his shattered, panicked survivors have just scrambled up the bluffs after their disastrous rout from the valley.
They're in bad shape.
They are beaten, bleeding, and terrified. And who rides up the trail but Captain Benteen?
Benteen's arrival is the defining tactical moment that prevents the total destruction of the entire 7th Cavalry.
He saves them.
He rides up with his 3 companies, about 120 fresh, unengaged men. He surveys the absolute chaos. Reno is, by all survivor accounts, deeply unnerved, covered in the blood of his scout, and essentially incapable of commanding.
Reno is just in shock.
Benteen steps in. He radiates cold, methodical, veteran professionalism. He immediately halts the panic. He orders his men to deploy in a circle, establishes a firm defensive perimeter on the high ground, and begins redistributing his men's ammunition to Reno's depleted, frantic troopers.
Shortly after, Captain McDougal arrives with Company B and the slow-moving pack train.
Which is huge.
This is absolutely crucial because the pack train contains the entire regimental reserve of ammunition, tens of thousands of rounds. So they now have roughly 350 men consolidating on this bluff, heavily armed but completely isolated.
They still don't know where Custer is. They hear heavy, continuous volley fire to the north.
They can hear the last stand happening.
Yes. At 1530 hours, Captain Thomas Weir, commanding Company D, decides he cannot just sit there while his commander is engaged.
So he takes action.
He directly disobeys the prevailing caution on the hill, moves his company north along the ridgeline to a high vantage point, now called Weir Point, to look for Custer.
He pushes out to try and find the hammer, but what does he actually see when he looks north?
He looks out over the landscape toward where Custer's ridges are, about 3 miles away. He doesn't see a cavalry formation riding to the rescue.
What does he see?
He sees massive, thick clouds of dust, the flash of hundreds of guns firing, and the terrain completely swarming with thousands of native warriors riding over the hills.
Oh, wow.
And then, the worst-case scenario happens. The warriors see him. As the fight on Last Stand Hill concludes and Custer's command is wiped out, the massive native force turns its attention southward, surging toward Weir's isolated company.
Good comfort for the rest of them.
Weir realizes he is about to be cut off and orders a frantic retreat. He barely makes it back to the Reno Hill perimeter before the entire weight of the native army slams into Benteen and Reno's lines.
You have to put yourself in the boots of the average trooper on Reno Hill. You just survived a massacre in the valley. You sit on a hill and hear massive, rolling volleys in the distance for maybe an hour.
Just listening to it.
Then silence, an eerie, heavy silence. And then thousands of victorious warriors turn their attention back to you, riding up the ridges, closing the ring. The psychological discipline required to hold that hill and not break and run is absolutely astounding.
And that leads right into the agonizing vigil. From the evening of June 25th entirely through the pitch-black night and into the scorching day of the 26th, those 350 survivors endure absolute hell.
How do they survive?
Well, they have no shovels or entrenching tools. They are digging shallow rifle pits in the rock-hard soil, using their meskin cups, hunting knives, and their bare hands.
Just scraping at the dirt.
Desperate to get below the incoming fire. They place the wounded in a slight depression in the center of the perimeter. The pack mules are tied down tightly to prevent them from stampeding.
And the thirst. I mean, the Montana heat in late June is brutal. They are pinned down on a dry, dusty bluff just a few hundred yards above the river, but completely cut off from it by snipers in the brush.
The psychological terror of that night siege is profound. Sniper fire plunges into their shallow pits from higher elevations. Warriors probe the lines in the darkness, trying to find a weak point to exploit.
Did they ever get water?
Small, incredibly brave parties of soldiers, many of whom later received the Medal of Honor, volunteered to crawl down deep, exposed ravines to the river in the pitch black.
That's incredibly brave.
They carried dozens of canteens to get water for the screaming wounded, facing point-blank fire from warriors hiding in the brush to do so. Captain Benteen spends the night fearlessly walking the lines, exposing himself to fire, kicking awake exhausted troopers who are falling asleep at their posts, and strictly enforcing fire discipline to conserve their precious ammunition.
He kept them alive.
He's the iron anchor holding that fragile perimeter together.
By the morning of the 26th, the sun comes up, and the troopers brace for the massive, overwhelming wave of warriors that will surely wipe them out. But the final, fatal attack never comes.
No, it doesn't.
Why not?
The native leadership, including Sitting Bull, recognizes that their primary objective has already been achieved. The village is safe. The cavalry threat has been shattered.
Right.
Furthermore, their scouts report that the other massive columns of the U.S. Army Terry, and Gibbon's slow but heavily armed infantry and artillery, are finally marching down the valley from the north.
The reinforcements finally arrive.
The native coalition does not want to fight a protracted, entrenched, conventional battle against artillery and massed infantry. That plays directly into the Army's strengths. They need to protect their families. So they break camp.
The troopers on Reno Hill watch in absolute awe as this immense municipality, thousands of lodges, tens of thousands of horses in the pony herds, and entire families, slowly packs up, sets fire to the prairie grass to cover their movement, and moves south toward the Bighorn Mountains in a massive, orderly column.
Surreal sight, I'm sure.
The siege lifts, and on the 27th of June, General Terry's infantry column finally arrives from the north. They relieve the exhausted, traumatized men on Reno Hill, and then Terry's men advance up the ridges to find Custer.
The scene they encountered on those ridges defied description. The bodies of Custer and his 210 men lay scattered across the hillsides, stripped of their clothing and severely mutilated.
It's important to understand the context of that, right?
Yes, we have to understand that mutilation was a customary practice among Plains Indians, intended to dishonor the enemy and ensure they walked the afterlife in a broken, crippled state. It was a spiritual act as much as an act of vengeance.
Right.
In total, the 7th Cavalry suffered 263 men dead and over 60 wounded. It was a catastrophic, unimaginable defeat for a military that considered itself vastly superior.
Let's talk about the battlefield today, because the aftermath is literally frozen in time. If you walk the Little Bighorn battlefield now, it is a deeply haunting experience. After the battle, Terry's men hurriedly buried the dead exactly where they lay, putting a thin layer of dirt over them in shallow graves.
Just a quick field burial.
Decades later, the military replaced those temporary stakes with permanent white marble headstones.
Those white markers are perhaps the most vital historical tool we have for understanding the flow of the battle. They form a permanent topographical map of the fighting.
What do you see when you look at them?
When you stand on Last Stand Hill and look south toward Calhoun Hill, you don't see a neat, orderly, heroic square formation like in the paintings. You see a chaotic spray of white dots tracing the ragged lines of retreat, the desperate clusters of men trapped in the ravines, and the isolated pockets where men fell fighting hand to hand.
It completely deconstructs the Romantic narrative. Custer's last stand became an American myth of a static, glorious, heroic defense against impossible odds, largely manufactured by romanticized Victorian paintings and popular media pushing a martyrdom narrative.
Oh, heavily manufactured.
But the ground itself, the spacing of those white markers, perfectly aligned with the forensic cartridge evidence, tells a story of movement, panic, fragmentation, and terrain-driven defeat.
Absolutely. The myth relies on Custer holding the high ground and fighting to the last bullet in a unified circle. The archaeology proves it was a running, desperate fight where the unit disintegrated under overwhelming pressure.
And the native perspective is finally represented there, too.
And it's crucial to mention that in 2003, the National Park Service dedicated the Indian Memorial near Last Stand Hill. It deeply contextualizes the native triumph, honoring the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors who fought brilliantly to defend their families and their way of life.
That's a vital addition.
It creates a necessary balance, recognizing that this ground is both the site of a profound U.S. military disaster and the absolute pinnacle of Native American tactical brilliance in the Plains Wars.
Which brings us to the ultimate analysis of what this battle actually meant. We have to look at the tactical versus the strategic outcome. Tactically on the ground, it is a flawless victory for the Native coalition.
A masterclass.
They used rapid mounted concentration, fully leveraged the microterrain to negate superior weaponry, and brought overwhelming firepower to bear at decisive points. It was a masterclass in mobile warfare. But strategically, what did this victory buy them?
Strategically, the Battle of the Little Bighorn was the high watermark of Native resistance, but it was a deeply Pyrrhic victory.
Why Pyrrhic?
Because the total destruction of Custer's command sent absolute shockwaves through Washington and the American public. It generated intense national outrage.
It backfired.
The federal government didn't reconsider their treaty violations. They doubled down with massive force. They flooded the plains with thousands of fresh troops, built new, permanent forts, and relentlessly pursued the bands through the brutal freezing winter of 1876 and 1877.
And the Native Alliance couldn't sustain that.
Right. The massive Native coalition could not sustain itself logistically for a year-round, protracted war of attrition. They couldn't feed 10,000 people while constantly on the run from the U.S. Army.
They had to break up.
They had to break apart into smaller bands just to hunt and survive the winter. By the spring of 1877, a starving, exhausted, crazy horse was forced to surrender at Fort Robinson. Sitting Bull fled across the border into Canada with his followers.
The end of the resistance.
The Black Hills were permanently annexed by the United States. The incredible tactical victory at the Little Bighorn ironically accelerated the very strategic defeat they were fighting so hard to prevent.
We've covered an incredible amount of ground today. From the broken promises of the Fort Laramie Treaty to the shattered anvil of Crook's forces at the Battle of the Rosebud, we examined Custer's fatal arrogance in dividing his forces based on outdated assumptions.
So many fatal assumptions.
We traced the terrified, chaotic retreat of Major Reno across the river, the frantic message from the coulee begging for ammunition, and the methodical, terrain-driven destruction of Custer's 5 companies along a dusty, jagged ridge, leaving only white marble markers to tell the true tale.
It is a profound historical lesson in the extreme dangers of underestimating an enemy, the vital importance of accurate intelligence, and the unforgiving, lethal nature of terrain when your opponent knows how to use it better than you do.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the source material, I want to leave you with a final, lingering thought. The Native warriors at the Little Bighorn achieved a massive, coordinated, tactical victory by stripping away their traditional, highly independent, decentralized fighting styles.
They became an army.
They came together to act as a unified, disciplined military force under brilliant tactical leaders like Crazy Horse. But considering the relentless, industrialized, railroad-backed logistics of the U.S. Army in 1876, if that Native alliance had somehow possessed their own logistical supply chain, their own agriculture, and the ability to wage a sustained year-round conventional military campaign, could the Battle of the Little Bighorn have been the start of a sovereign Native nation in the West, rather than the violent, tragic beginning of the end? Something to mull over. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.